Alrighty, guess we'll get going here. So good morning. I'm Jim Collins. I'm a principal consultant with AWS Professional Services. Um, my background is primarily in the U.S. government, the Department of Defense space. I cover our national security business as well. Super excited to talk to you all about the Landing Zone Accelerator on AWS. Kind of depending on your familiarity with other talks that we've done over the past couple years, this has been in multiple forms. We've got multiple landing zone platforms, products, infrastructure as code solutions that AWS produces. We're super excited to talk to you about this iteration, the Landing Zone Accelerator on AWS. My partner, Randy Domingo, couldn't make it this week, but this is really his, he is the principal engineer and the lead developer of the solution. So again, super excited to talk to you about it. Like I mentioned, my background's primarily in defense and government. And a lot of our customers come to us and say, in professional services, how do we build a landing zone that meets US government security and compliance rules? I have healthcare customers who come and ask the same thing about HIPAA and Part 2 data, high trust, PCI, SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, and even our global customers who are subject to various rules and regulations depending on the location of where they're storing data and their country of residence. So again, a lot of these landing zones are designed to address the security and compliance requirements that we have across multiple customer bases. So we'll just kind of get rolling here. Want to talk a little bit up front around how important this foundational infrastructure is and how integral these landing zones are to establishing a secure and compliant baseline for your applications in the cloud. Today's companies, today's enterprises, today's governments are always asking for that prescriptive guidance around, what are those architectural best practices? How do I make my infrastructure, high performing and scalable and resilient? And then, more and more, they're asking us, how do we make this sustainable? We're closing down data centers. We're migrating on-prem applications to AWS. What does that foundational enterprise infrastructure need to look like? We publish a lot of guidance. You're probably all familiar with the AWS documentation, AWS support. We have the white papers. We have the cloud adoption framework, the security reference architecture, and I can go on and on and on. One of the core asks of customers is, okay, so you have all this guidance and you have all of this documentation. Can you help me put it together in an infrastructure as code package? Can you give me a little bit more hints about how to construct a body of code, repeatable artifacts and repeatable code snippets that I can go deploy in my environment? So that's what we're going to talk about today. I talk about this a lot in other talks and in front of other audiences as well. But what we're finding is that when you run your workloads on AWS, there's obviously the myriad number of services that we provide. But taking those services in combination with how you configure and tweak your security settings, we can help you get at least 60% of the way in terms of the security controls that you either inherit directly from AWS or as you move up the stack. And I'll show you, kind of go over the controls here in a minute. But as you move higher up into the stack from managing the physical data centers all the way up to user content and really primarily what customers are interested in, how do I secure my workloads? We can help you with that foundational infrastructure and allow you to, again, to move further up the stack into that shared responsibility model. And I'll kind of go into this here. It's kind of a natural lead in. A lot of these government customers, healthcare customers, and anybody else who's highly regulated, a lot of their compliance questions, a lot of the things that they need to address generally track towards the NIST 853 control set. If you work within this space, this won't come to any surprise. I mentioned that when we're kind of working towards helping our customers kind of increase the amount of coverage that we help them hit with these compliance controls, you naturally inherit things at the data center, the virtualization, and the core networking layers. We move kind of further up the stack here, and then that kind of moves more into your territory and kind of what you have to cover. The personnel and incident response, things that we manage in our data centers, things that we manage on your behalf, they're naturally able to be inherited in these compliance packages. I'd be remiss if I didn't share a slide around shared responsibility. You're probably going to see 3 or 4 different variations of this slide as you attend other sessions today. But I did want to touch upon the shared responsibility model and how it fits into the overall landing zone accelerator concept. Security and compliance is obviously a shared responsibility among customers and AWS. What's really difficult and what we find our customers struggle with is how do you actually execute on the things that are kind of north of that dotted line? So we, again, handle our global infrastructure. We handle the availability zones, we handle regions, edge locations. But then you get into questions around, how do I encrypt my data? Do we use client-side encryption? What flavor of server-side encryption should I be using? What flavor of operating system? How do I configure my firewalls? What about third-party firewalls? Can I use an AWS managed service to augment those capabilities? It gets a little bit more complicated and difficult, especially when you're trying to manage, hundreds, thousands of AWS accounts at scale. And that's really where the Landing Zone Accelerator solution is designed to kind of hit on. Customers manage their applications and content, the IAM or identity and access management platforms, guest operating systems and things of that nature, but they're looking to us to kind of help orchestrate a lot of that and make, again, anything north of that dotted line just a bit easier. In the professional services function, what we're finding is customers understand the AWS foundational aspects, and that's all just kind of inherent in doing these application and these workload migrations to the cloud. There are many permutations and many choices that customers can make around what is the best option, what are the best most optimal configurations for their particular workloads. And again, we want to use the Landing Zone Accelerator to kind of help with a known set of good configurations to kind of, again, use the word over and over again, accelerate your migrations into AWS. As I mentioned before, there's dozens of AWS native security services to help you secure these cloud environments. You've probably all heard of Amazon GuardDuty, Macy, Detective, Organizations, Security Hub, and so on. But again, I wanted to make sure and draw your attention to just the areas that the Landing Zone Accelerator is designed to orchestrate and automate. We talk about threat detection and modeling. We talk about just overall security posture, assessing your environment for the various security controls that we'll go into. When there's an incident, and there will always be an incident, how do you do root cause analysis? What are those tools? What's the infrastructure? How does that support kind of determining where an incident may have happened, where a breach may have happened? And then finally, how do you do sensitive data recovery? So again, when there are incidents and when there are issues, how do you recover that data and kind of move on with your operations? So again, more building blocks here. I wanted to just underscore, with all of these choices and with all of these services that we provide, it's very easy to look at it and get overwhelmed as you're trying to put together the foundational architecture for a landing zone or for any cloud environment for that matter. There's plenty of services and there's plenty of robustness in our service offerings, but it comes down to how do I configure each of these services to integrate with my overall architecture pattern? How do I, again, scale the configurations and keep track of the different permutations as you go between different AWS accounts, maybe different regions, different availability zones, and even in a hybrid model, if you're going kind of back into multiple clouds or even back to on-prem, as might be the case with VMware Cloud and AWS. So Landing Zone Accelerator is designed to take a lot of these services, in fact, most of these services, and integrate the key capabilities into an out-of-box experience. Really trying to save time and map a lot of the controls that you can inherit from these services, from the use of these services, to the environment that you're building. More core questions here, again, that we get from customers. How do I build that secure foundation? How do I configure, orchestrate, manage, and scale these services together? How do I reduce that overall O&M, the operations and management burden? We find a lot of people, a lot of customers will start deploying an initial infrastructure, the various landing zone permutations, and then they start kind of experimenting with ClickOps. In other words, going into the console, kind of clicking around, making changes, and now your secure baseline is now out of alignment with what that known good foundation was supposed to be. We really wanted to kind of make the experience easier such that if you had to make a change, or if you're adding additional AWS accounts, or you're working in GovCloud, or you're working in the Amazon dedicated cloud regions, that you have that consistent set of controls and those consistent configurations such that you're not doing, a certain set of operations in the commercial cloud regions or in these 3 availability zones, but something completely different in GovCloud or in the air gap space. So really kind of boiling the ocean here, but these landing zones, they're great as long as you have that consistent O&M footprint across wherever you might be operating. And again, government customers, and I probably should have taken a poll, there's a lot of opportunity to make this easier for customers who are not just operating, say, in US East 1 or US West 2. And again, we have a lot of customers who will come to us and say, I love the idea of a landing zone, but Control Tower is not yet in GovCloud. Control Tower is not yet in the Amazon dedicated cloud regions. How can you help make this a more consistent experience? So again, that's the use case that we're trying to hit on here. Foundationally, again, you need a landing zone. That is that secure, stable, scalable, stable inherently, multi-account AWS environment. It's that starting point for new development, for new experimentation, and ideation, iteration of new capabilities. It's important, what we find is it's important to kind of let your developers, let your mission owners in the government space go kind of harness the power of these new AWS services, but in a controlled way. So it's okay, go use a new feature of, say, a data machine learning service or an AI ML service, but do it in a way that doesn't expose data either to the public internet or to other enclaves that should not have that data exposed to them. And to have, again, that consistent experience, no matter if you're, I guess, a back office IT function, or you're a healthcare, experimenting with healthcare capabilities, or if you're a defense customer who obviously doesn't necessarily want their data spread across all of these commercial cloud regions. So again, it has to be rigid enough, but flexible enough to allow for that experimentation without worrying about going in and clicking through, did I turn on guard duty? Did I turn on Macy? Did I turn on all these things that, are not actually controlled by any sort of, I guess, global configuration? That's where this concept of the landing zone accelerator really comes from. So what are the elements of the landing zone? Again, designed to be secure and compliant. What does that secure baseline look like? What is that consistent kind of experience across multiple regions, multiple availability zones, even multiple environments? What does that baseline look like? And then obviously, as you're bringing new customers, new mission owners, new capabilities into your environment, how does that scale? How are you able to ensure that as you're deploying containers in Fargate, or you're deploying additional SageMaker workspaces or workbooks, how do you know that that's going to be scalable enough to meet your organization's requirements? And again, how do you know that those configurations of those services are consistent and they're being consistently applied? So the landing zone itself provides that baseline, that foundational environment to get started with the multi-account architecture. It allows you to implement that consistent identity and access management foundation, all the consistent data security controls, your consistent network design, and logging, again, which forms an important tenet in this overall architecture. I already mentioned the importance of being adaptable and flexible. I do a little bit of story time here. For customers in the government space, a lot of the time it's the set it and forget it type of model, where you draw kind of a picture on a whiteboard, and then that is the architecture that will exist for 1, 2, 3 years, because that has been what has been accredited. And in order to go make changes to it, you need to go back through a very laborious change control board. You may have to go pull up screenshots of the AWS console. You may have to go dig out PowerPoints or Word documents that described the world as it was a year ago, and it may not be the case of what it looks like now. But what we're finding is, as we start introducing things like consolidated code repositories, landing zones that are backed by infrastructure as code and backed by code that is being under a change control or change management process, we're finding that organizations and even the government, they look at these repositories and say, well, now I can track the provenance, I can track where this code came from, and I can see that you're applying consistent configurations across all of these environments. The feedback that we get is, this stuff is hard. There's a lot of intricacy and there's a lot of nuance to developing code artifacts that do this at the scale that these customers are looking for. It's easy to kind of put together a series of CloudFormation templates or Terraform templates, or even the CDK projects. but how do you do it at scale? And how do you manage the overall, enterprise IT, if you will, of these landing zones? So at long last, we can start kind of talking about what the Landing Zone Accelerator on AWS is. So at its core, it is an open source software solution that is designed to deploy that foundational cloud infrastructure and accelerates those security controls on AWS. Again, we have so many resources available that looking at kind of the body of what we recommend in terms of security controls for a multi-account architecture, what does this look like in code? How do we instantiate this in a software solution that you can go to GitHub and download it and then deploy it into your environment and then scale it? So as we release new capabilities, as we release new AWS services, how can you use this foundational body of code to start managing your environment at scale? So we call this no code. It is code, right? No code is a bit of a buzzword, but this integrates about 35 services into the solution. And I'm going to get into kind of the overall architecture and what this looks like from an inheritance perspective. So again, what does this build on? What services does it use? And how do you tweak them to fit in, individual organizational compliance constraints? So our government customers have similar but different rules and regulations than our healthcare customers. And even our enterprise, media, oil and gas customers have slightly different tweaks that they want to make. And it's relatively easy here through this solution. So this is, again, kind of a repeat of the slide before. So let me see if I can figure out how to use the clicker here. More of the benefits here. I wanted to go through 6 of the key benefits. And then we'll roll right into the actual capabilities of the solution. So the whole idea is this provides that flexible framework from which you can integrate other management tools, not just AWS services, but this provides kind of the hooks that you can use to integrate, for example, third-party firewalls, third-party IDS, IPS systems, identity management systems, any sort of accreditation software or software that might be kind of present in your organization today. All of this is API driven. It wouldn't be AWS without it. So it's designed to be very flexible, but not forcing you to go into the weeds of the code to figure out how to go make a slight change to a security control. It's designed to abstract this out just a step further so that you have more flexibility to kind of make the right choices that fit your organization's mission. So it's, like I mentioned before, it was engineered by the global AWS security teams, security and compliance experts, to leverage all of our best practices. And again, consolidating this down into a baseline that allows you to kind of pick and choose what suits you. Important point that I always kind of remiss if I don't kind of say the organizational aspects out loud here, but your teams, your IT administration teams, your developers, they can focus on things that are not foundational infrastructure. In other words, how do I attach an EBS volume in a secure and compliant way? But how do I actually provide capabilities to my end users? How do I actually expose to them services and capabilities that they're actually going to use versus figuring out how to use KMS with the service that they're interested in using, or figuring out how to make that match, those settings match to whatever the organization's baseline is. It's important to kind of point out that a lot of these organizations kind of struggle with, there's a list of security controls and they leave it on the mission owner, or they leave it on the app owner to go figure out how to implement it in AWS. And that causes a lot of delay, that causes a lot of churn. And again, when we talk about accreditation and when IT security teams go in and look at this code in these environments, it's nice to be able to say, here's the consistent pattern, here's what everybody is subject to, and have that very evident by the code configuration. So again, we want to make sure that developers especially, are able to focus on the things that make these organizations different, the undifferentiated heavy lifting that we are doing. We want to take that, a lot of that burden away from the mission owner. And again, you can deploy this code, this solution in a matter of hours. We say days, not weeks, but what we really mean there is there's a lot of planning that needs to go into structuring a landing zone, into structuring enterprise architecture in general. So when we say days, we really mean you can actually whiteboard out what these landing zones are supposed to look like, and then you can instantiate your configuration, essentially in plain language, very quickly, and then test it out. Because the foundation is very flexible, you can wipe your accounts clean and start over again if it's not what you were looking for. But again, the agility and the flexibility here is a key reason we developed this solution. And then finally, and I mentioned this several times now, but the whole point is to establish that compliant baseline, but not have you guess what the security controls need to be. I think a lot of the time we do a good job kind of presenting the myriad number of parameters that you can configure and expose them out through the APIs and SDK and even through the console. But we have customers who will ask, well, how do I, what should my retention policy look like? How do I configure that universally across my entire environment? What are the implications of making this one small change in the console? How does this replicate across n number of accounts? So again, making sure that we have that compliant baseline that can be essentially shared across multiple, potentially hundreds to thousands of AWS accounts. So now as we kind of talk about, well, where does Landing Zone Accelerator really fit in the kind of the solution portfolio? Where does it fit with respect to AWS Control Tower? I wanted to make sure to kind of present this in a way that you kind of get the, where the, I guess the differentiators are for each capability here. So at the very foundational layer, you have the AWS account, which is that foundational container for AWS resources. That's kind of your out-of-the-box security perimeter, security and billing perimeter. And we build on top of that with Control Tower. So there's important capabilities that Control Tower will deploy or will enable, and that is that initial multi-account structure. There's also the idea of an account factory. So again, stamping out AWS accounts in multiple regions that look like your templated or your ideal, what your ideal end state for that account should look like in terms of security guardrails and controls. But it also configures AWS organizations for you in the regions where AWS organizations exist. And then again, it configures those initial preventative and detective guardrails. What Landing Zone Accelerator is designed to do is to go much further kind of into the configuration. So as you kind of, if you remember the shared responsibility model, we're pushing further up into what does the key policy need to look like? What does core networking need to look like? What does the communication pathways that Transit Gateway enable, what does that need to look like? And how do we do all that work for you in such a way that you don't have to go in and figure out, well, do I attach the Transit Gateway to my network account, but not to my logging account? Do I attach it to that mission owner, but not this other mission owner? So again, Landing Zone Accelerator is designed to ask those types of questions and make it easier for you to kind of stamp out those configurations without having to deploy additional CloudFormation on top of Control Tower or do additional customizations. So again, we integrate more of the AWS security services. We do more of that foundational networking. So again, your VPC structure, and then additional configuration management. And how a lot of this is accomplished, and I'll show you this in a second here, all of this is essentially a giant pipeline through Code Pipeline. And at its core, this is a code build project written in CDK and TypeScript. All of this code is configuration managed in a way that you can go in, you can watch how the pipeline executes, you can make changes to those configuration files, and as the Code Pipeline recognizes what those changes are, does a sanity check, does a bunch of other checks, the pipeline will go out and actually update your entire environment to match however it is that you're configuring. That at scale, I guess, is kind of one of the biggest challenges we were trying to solve here. Again, making all of these accounts and all of these environments essentially be consistent across a security baseline. I do want to briefly talk about Control Tower because this solution, Landing Zone Accelerator, is built essentially on top of or adjacent to Control Tower, and it incorporates those foundational capabilities that Control Tower provides. But we go a bit further. This solution can be deployed standalone, and in fact, in regions that Control Tower is not available yet, like GovCloud and the Amazon dedicated cloud regions, you can deploy it standalone. But once it's there, once it becomes available, or even in the commercial regions today, we take full advantage of Control Tower's capabilities. And as Control Tower, the service continues to release new features and capabilities, this solution, Landing Zone Accelerator, will keep up with them. So we will also consume those same services and then deprecate some of the capabilities that we have written to make use of the managed service. That's all that, that's intended to be transparent to those who are using the solution. You can make these choices though. That's kind of the nice thing about these types of projects that build on top of foundational capabilities. You can decide which regions you need to work in. You can decide whether or not Control Tower meets kind of that foundational need, or you can deploy it without. But again, we allow you that kind of control or that choice to determine what meets your particular use case. Really trying to kind of abstract away the idea that if you're operating in a standard or commercial region and also operating in GovCloud and potentially elsewhere, it's that common look and feel, it's that common baseline. We are using that common framework and that common language such that you're not having to manage a bespoke solution in GovCloud, which is more often the case than we would potentially like from an operations and maintenance perspective, that you would be running in a commercial region. So again, it's that consistent experience and those consistent controls that this solution is designed to enable. Again, wanted to recap, and then I'm going to kind of go into, we'll actually look at a little bit of code and kind of walk through how you can actually configure Landing Zone Accelerator to meet different use cases. So again, core idea here is that the solution builds that secure and compliant foundation pretty quickly, versus kind of going through and building CloudFormation out kind of bespoke and ad hoc. Instead of focusing on the foundational infrastructure, which should really just be there and ready to be consumed, it allows you to spend time and money elsewhere, and especially on things like innovation and transformation, and not worrying about, again, are my EBS volumes secured? Is my S3 bucket public? Are these foundational capabilities that really should just be inherent in these environments that your mission owners or that your customers are using? We wanted to go, again, further up the shared responsibility model to make opinionated configuration choices, like the best practices, the baseline, the secure by default configuration, really to accelerate your readiness for compliance and shorten the time that it's going to take for your teams to go out and look at each of these AWS services and say, well, which one of these things is considered secure for my organization? Which one of these knobs do I have to turn to get these compliance, security and compliance controls to look like the way that AWS thinks that this should look? So again, we wanted to make this more out of the box and less, to kind of reduce the guesswork from other solutions. I mentioned already that the environment is pipeline driven with that integrated change management. So again, using code pipeline, using the idea of a DevOps pipeline to instantiate these environments across multiple AWS accounts makes the management of that code base much easier. So you're not having to stamp out bespoke templates in each of these individual accounts. The pipeline drives what's actually going to be deployed in those environments. I mentioned before also that this comes right out of GitHub. We have at the end of the presentation, I've got a QR code that'll take you right to the solution page. But you can deploy this right out of GitHub, or you could download the entire solution and deploy it locally. You can call us in professional services, and we have partners that are building solutions on top of this code base as well. The other thing that's interesting about this solution, this is also supported by AWS support. So one of the things that we tried really hard to do was, there's a lot of builder projects, there's a lot of sample code out there, but we wanted to create that solution that, if you filed a support case or picked up the phone, there'd be somebody there who understood what this architecture looked like and how it was built to kind of get you a resolution pretty quickly. So again, that was one of those core tenets of how we were building Landing Zone Accelerator. For our customers that are, highly regulated and have to go through some sort of accreditation or attestation program, and again, those are usually the FedRAMP customers, the HIST and NIST 853 and HITRUST customers. One of the things that they had asked us to do, and the things that actually kind of helps people and saves them a bit of time, is show me which control families that this solution is designed to address, and how do I what do I actually inherit? What do I get in terms of kind of looking across NIST 853? what are the different choices that I can make, and how do these different solutions compare and contrast and make my life easier. So as I talked about a few minutes ago, AWS natively covers the bottom four here, data center up through compute and storage. We provide all those raw materials, and we manage a lot of that capability for you. But again, as you move up, and you kind of move closer into how is my application configured? How do I do configuration management? What does high availability look like for my workload? What we've found is customers will kind of roll their own solution to meet log management and monitoring all the way up to personnel, but kept asking, how can you make this easier? So again, Landing Zone Accelerator, and the reason the hybrid controls there right in the middle in the pink, it's designed to be a little bit more opinionated about what good looks like, not necessarily authoritative. It may not fit all of the particular use cases, but again, it gives you that good starting point, and kind of those known good defaults for which you can build off additional security and compliance controls. There's also other resources on the solutions page that I'll show you that kind of get into how do each of these elements of Landing Zone Accelerator meet these control families. We get asked a lot of the time, how do we write a body of evidence? How do we justify or create that narrative that what we are creating, what that foundational infrastructure looks like? How do I communicate that to my assessor? How do I communicate that to a third party who's looking at my environment and saying, how did you configure this, and what makes it secure? So again, a lot of those resources come with this solution as well. All right, so as we talk kind of architecture now, we'll kind of get into more of the actual details. High level, the solution starts with a CloudFormation template. So if you go to our website, so if you go to the AWS Solutions website, the one-click deploy is a CloudFormation template that will instantiate the solution in your account. So you give it a bit of data, or you tell it where you'd like this deployed, and then it starts rolling, right? The actual structure of the project itself is based on that CloudFormation template and that initial bootstrapping in CDK, and then you define what those configuration files look like. It's important to know that we've kind of created what that known good framework looks like in those configuration files, but then the Landing Zone Accelerator, the CDK project itself, goes and parses those files and then instantiates all of the accounts, those multiple environments from those configuration files. I touched upon this before. The installer itself is separate from the configuration. So if you've worked with CloudFormation, you've worked with Terraform and all of these kind of declarative ways of instantiating infrastructure, we wanted to kind of remove the installer and the deployment engine from the configuration so that you can go in, you can make a change in the configuration, code pipeline will pick up the change and then start, again, making whatever changes you need to be made. There's controls and gates in there, of course, and authentication mechanisms. But at the bottom line, instead of kind of baking all of this into a landing zone that's maybe represented by 4 to 6 CloudFormation templates, you can actually experiment in those configuration files and push out changes or push out additional services as you need to, and turn them off if you need to at scale. Again, I mentioned what powers Landing Zone Accelerator. It is a CDK project. It's code build, right? All this code is stored and compiled in code build, and then that is what the pipeline will go out and execute in these additional AWS accounts. Because everybody likes visuals. I'm a highly visual learner, and as we were developing this, it was kind of neat to watch. As you go out and make changes in the environment, the pipeline starts picking them up and starts doing a bit of sanity checking for you. It'll start kind of displaying what your configuration looks like as it's deploying it real time. But again, I wanted to just kind of give you all a visual in lieu of a live demo here, what this kind of looks like in the console. As you're kind of pulling in the source and it starts building and compiling, cut for brevity here, but it starts going down and actually checks to make sure that those AWS accounts are ready to receive those configurations. It checks for the presence of control tower and a lot of the prereqs that kind of depending on the configuration that you're deploying, we'll go out and make sure that all of those things are met. But again, I wanted a visual here just so you can kind of see when the pipeline starts running, it goes through a series of steps. And then until finally you've got the state that you've declared deployed in that multi-account arrangement. All right, so I hope you can all see. So I'm about to present a bit of code so I can kind of show you what the structure of these configuration files look like. There's going to be a couple pictures here because probably many of you are probably familiar with what a standard kind of out-of-the-box landing zone looks like. But at the very core and kind of what this builds is a series of accounts and a series of AWS organizational units. So this really serves as the foundation for the landing zone accelerator. And this essentially is what Control Tower builds as well. So if you're using Control Tower, we consume this structure. If you're not, this solution will instantiate this for you. And now, how do you actually define what your configuration looks like? So I'm going to step through a couple different configurations from what does an organizational unit look like? How do I configure an additional AWS account? How do I go in and configure additional security and compliance rules? How do I integrate Security Hub? How do I modify core or enterprise networking? And there's a whole host of other things. But again, I wanted to kind of give you an idea of what this looks like. So we'll start with the OU structure. If I can roll forward here. So just kind of draw your attention to how you actually define what your OUs look like. Now, out of the box, we match what our secure reference architecture looks like. But you've got security and infrastructure, dev, test, prod. But really, it can be anything that you need for what your organization is looking for. But once you define what those OUs look like, now you start defining, well, what are the service control policies that those OUs need to be subject to? So in this particular example, and as I'm kind of showing here, we've got those foundational guardrails configured out of the box. That's the guardrails JSON file. And the deployment target here is the infrastructure OU. But really the key to understand here is you can actually go in and instantiate additional code blocks here to say, well, I want a different policy to apply to my dev or test than I would for prod. Or for example, I have an infrastructure OU where my centralized routing or my centralized networking account is. There's a different security posture that I want to instantiate for that particular function. But this is kind of the section of the code and the configuration file where you can make those changes. Kind of draw a couple more, even though the red boxes aren't drawn around this. You can control tagging policies. That's another ask of customers is, I'd love to do something with tagging, but it's kind of a bespoke configuration right now. How do I centrally manage tagging across all of these accounts in my entire estate? So you can define what that looks like with the tagging policies. There's a backup policies area as well. That again, more ways that you can standardize on what these accounts look like. I'm going too fast here. We'll step back. So when you're defining workload accounts, so these are your application accounts, your mission-facing accounts. Anything that's not necessarily core to the landing zone itself, this is what that code block looks like, defining just common things. What does the email address look like that's attached to that AWS account? And then what is the OU that you want to put it in? So in other words, how does it inherit some of those security controls that you defined over here in the service control policies, but also in the landing zone itself? So it's pretty straightforward. You can literally just copy those 3 lines and add additional workload accounts as you need to. And then again, define what OU that they belong in. So again, very flexible, easy to kind of expand the estate. All in code, again, so all of this is configuration managed, but it's very simple to, again, stamp out what those accounts need to look like in relation to the OUs and the policies that you've described. These changes that I'm talking about, so as you make changes, again, once you commit this code, this configuration file back to the repository, Code Pipeline will pick this up immediately and start executing on, in this case, it's bringing those accounts into the management of the landing zone accelerator. So now that configuration file, as I skip ahead a little bit, builds essentially this frame. So now, again, you have a network account, the shared services account, the audit security and tooling, and then n number of workload accounts that you may have defined in your configuration. I want to talk about kind of what the log archive account and the audit security and tooling account, how we configure them next. So we'll spend a little bit of time there. So the configuration for those capabilities, especially for security controls, services like GuardDuty, Security Hub, Config, for example, your password policies, and CloudWatch. Again, all declarative here in this configuration. I did want to kind of draw your attention to the ability to define a delegated administrator. So as we talk about the idea of least privilege and only using administrator accounts and more highly privileged accounts only in the places that they're needed, Landing Zone Accelerator helps with that delegated administration configuration. So this member account here, the audit account, that is the delegated administrator in this particular configuration for those administrative functions. So again, you don't have to go in and kind of point and click your way through organizations or IAM to figure out how that this will get configured across multiple different AWS accounts. So this gives you that flexibility and kind of ease of use to configure it once and centrally here. Kind of move into Security Hub. You've got multiple choices here. Again, these are the defaults for the out-of-the-box configuration. By default, we configure and deploy Security Hub and turn it on. We aggregate region findings. So again, another common use case is I'm working in US East 1 or US West 2. I also want to work in, either out in a backup region or a secondary or tertiary region, but I want to turn on the findings, or I want to collect all those findings from Security Hub in one central place. So this configuration allows you to do that. You can exclude regions if you don't want those findings compiled inside of that one audit account. And then you can define what standards that you want to actually deploy. So again, this is the foundational security best practices. And then we find customers have a whole host of controls that they want to disable. They may not be applicable to that particular environment. You can go in and actually disable them in code. And again, you've got your audit trail to kind of fall back on to see what you've configured and which accounts are subject to which controls. For config, again, you can enable the config service that gets deployed and configured across multiple accounts. You can enable the recorder and where the findings are delivered to. You can define which OUs and which deployment targets you want the findings to go in. And then, of course, each of the individual rules. So again, just by way of example here, is a user part of an IAM group? Are they in a specific group? You define what that resource type looks like, and then define the identifier. And again, that gets propagated across whatever your estate may look like. You can define those specific rules. And again, this is all controlled by code. The whole idea here is just, again, configure it once, apply it to multiple and n number of OUs, n number of accounts, and you have this in a kind of in a centralized location, and then it's quick to propagate. So again, the pipeline will go out and make these changes very quickly after you commit. So again, just filling out the chart here. So now we were talking about the services and the security and audit account. So that was the KMS, Guard Duty, and Security Hub. And now kind of we'll move into the networking, which is actually one of the more interesting configurations, because a customer pain point has always been, how do I configure my VPCs to talk to each other? What does my core enterprise networking have to look like? And how do I configure route sharing and route propagation and sharing of the transit gateway construct across hundreds of accounts? I'll talk about the default VPC, but I'll drop down into the infrastructure OU real quick here. Transit gateway, again, the one area that we wanted to consolidate the configuration. You define what that transit gateway looks like. You can define what your VPC endpoint configuration looks like. And then this gets propagated across the multiple accounts in that configuration that you're looking for. So we have customers who have very complex routing design, or communication between multiple VPCs, multiple accounts. This is the one place that you can define where we're doing all of this route propagation and what your route tables look like in one, essentially one configuration file. A lot of the kind of the heavy lifting is done by the pipeline based on what you're configuring here for network attachments or transit gateway attachments. And we found that that's kind of the big cost savings in terms of time, so that you can define this once here and not have to go through each individual account or modify each individual template specifically. For the transit gateway, I did also want to make the point that all you have to define is the logical name for the transit gateway itself. That's network-main here. And we handle all those associations. We handle the propagations, and the same thing for the interface endpoints. So things like the Route 53 resolvers, the Route 53 private hosted zones, that's all part of this configuration file as well. But again, a lot of this is around time savings, not having to go in and configure each of these configuration parameters in a bunch of different files. Finally, you get the consolidated picture that, again, maybe many of you are used to looking at. I did want to just kind of say there are multiple patterns. We've kind of followed and I've talked today about the security reference architecture. That's this pattern that you're seeing on screen here. For government customers, they're subject to different control regimes and different architecture patterns. The whole kind of point behind Landing Zone Accelerator is you have that flexibility to define what that pattern should look like, but you can still use all of those capabilities from the deployment engine to go deploy those consolidated security controls or consolidated logging, or really anything about how, as we talk about Security Hub and Guard Duty and these core security capabilities, they're easy to kind of deploy into any pattern. This just so happens to be the one that our security reference architecture kind of defines out of the box. So again, when you kind of look at, we just spoke about the networking account and the networking capabilities. You can define how you want those VPCs to look. You can define how and which shared services you might want to incorporate. But the idea here is flexibility. You get to kind of decide how this is going to look. We will do the heavy lifting for you in terms of automation and the security and compliance guardrails. I got about 10 minutes left, but I'm going to kind of wrap up here. And I'll take questions off stage, or if you want to talk after. But I did want to just kind of show the GitHub repository for where this code exists, but also the Landing Zone Accelerator Solutions page, where you can learn more about the security controls, how to install, configure, and deploy. And again, more graphics. That's kind of my thing. Is I want to see more pictures what this will build, and kind of more ideas on how to configure for your particular use case. So I appreciate the time. Thank you very much for sticking with me and kind of going through the Landing Zone Accelerator. Please, feel free to download the code. It's a GitHub project, so if you run into issues or are looking for feature requests, this is where we're kind of taking them, just right on the public GitHub. And this is where we release new versions of the solution itself. I'll leave this up for another couple seconds here, but that's all I've got. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the attention. Thanks for being in Boston. It's good to see you all in person again.